part of the question is, where does some of the language that appears in the Book of Mormon that's not in the King James Bible come from? If Joseph Smith is the translator, where do these phrases come from?
Discovered a lot of Jonathan Edwards' language in the Book of Mormon, which
Yes,
nobody else
yes.
had seen before. Okay, how would Joseph had come by this language? If I were to say to you, I'm going to describe to you a young boy who, because of some medical issues, started to read a lot when he's 7 or 8. He's into all kinds of different literature, and he's just a voracious reader, and he's always thinking about religious issues. You'd say, wow, that kid sounds like a real little nerd, doesn't he?
Yeah.
That was Joseph Smith. Joseph was a nerd.
All right, welcome to Latter-day Saint Ideas. I'm Andrew Knopp. I am glad to be joined today by my friend Jim Lucas, who have had on the channel before and has been willing to come back and share some more information with us. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
I wanted to give Jim's bio for those of you who may not have heard it in our last video. James W. Lucas is an attorney who has lived in New York City most of his adult life, but is now living in Utah. He received his undergraduate degree from Brigham Young University and law degree from Columbia University. In recent years, he has written both books and articles on constitutional and public policy matters. In the field of LDS history, he has presented at several conferences, co-authored with Warner Woodworth, Working Toward Zion, Principles of the United Order for the Modern World, and done research on the history of the Latter-day Saints in New York City. The latter has included writing the entry on Mormons for the Encyclopedia of New York City and a chapter in New York Glory, Religion in the City by NYU Press. Most recently, he has co-authored with Jonathan Neville by means of the Urim and Thummim, Restoring Translation to the Restoration, which is this book, which you can all get at Digital Legend or Amazon. And it's a great book. Loved reading it. And it's part of why Jim is here today to talk about some of the great info they have in their book about young Joseph Smith, which I found fascinating. Goes contrary to sometimes the narrative we hear about Joseph Smith as a young man. But I want to let Jim talk about that. So Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can get us started.
Okay. Just one last thing about by means of the Urim and Thummim. I hope very, very shortly to have that available in as an audiobook.
Oh, awesome. Great.
And that would be available on Amazon. The book is about translation of the Book of Mormon. Part of that is asking the question, how did Joseph become translator? And he really genuinely did translate it, like he said, including working from the plates with the help of the Urim and Thummim interpreters. What was it about Joseph that enabled him to do that? Obviously, he was working with the Holy Spirit and the gift and power of God. But what was there about Joseph that led him to be able to carry out that task? So,
and isn't part of the question is, where does some of the language that appears in the Book of Mormon that's not in the King James Bible come from? If Joseph Smith is the translator.
That's right. So if we are going to say that Joseph was a translator, as he said he was, a translator obviously has to have some, assistance, since he was not a traditional translator in that he didn't go to school to learn like a Bible translator would go to school to learn Hebrew or Greek. So that's what the Urim and Thummim interpreters helped him with. But nonetheless, a translator has to express what he's translating into his own words and his own language. That's what a translator does. So the question is, here's this kid that everyone agrees was quite young. He's in his early 20s. There's lots of arguments about his education, but it was limited. He certainly didn't go to college. He certainly did not have any kind of extensive training or education. So how does it that he's able to translate this 500 plus page book? And if you included the lost pages, our Book of Mormon would be like 700 plus pages, which is a major piece of work, even for a regular scholarly trained translator. That's a big translation job. So just to do quick chronology, Joseph Smith was born in 1805. We don't know a ton about his early life, but we know more than I think a lot of people realize, chiefly through the biography that his mother wrote in 1844. But we also have other bits and pieces of information we can put together about his early life. So here are the major events. The first one here is that he had in about 1812, when he was 6 or 7 years old, a major surgery on his leg. There was a typhoid epidemic in his area, and his leg got infected, and the normal procedure would have been to amputate the leg, but he happened to live not too far from Dartmouth College, and so there was a surgeon from Dartmouth College that came by and performed a quite radical, newfangled surgery that saved his leg. So that happened in 1812. Then we have the first vision, which happens about 1820 when he's 14, 15. And then he begins to have visits from Moroni for 4 years. He finally gets the plates, and they translate lots of pages with his Martin Harris, and then Martin Harris loses the pages. And then finally, Arlo Cowdery shows up, and they're able to bear down and actually get the translation done in basically 1829. And then in 1830, the Book of Mormon is published in the early part of the year, I think March. And then, of course, in April, the church is organized. Okay, now let's just do a touch of genealogy. Joseph Smith was descended from the Puritan pilgrims who came from England, and he had an ancestor who came over on the Mayflower. And it's very important, they were very religious people, but I don't know sometimes if we fully appreciate just how religious they were. These were folks who had fled from England to Holland and then come to America because they really wanted to follow what they saw as the true religion, and religion was absolutely at the center of their life. So Joseph Smith was descended from these people, and he even had an ancestor who came over on the Mayflower. And the guy who actually fell overboard, he happened to catch hold. The storm had ripped loose a rope, the rigging, and was able to pull himself. And then people saw him and pulled him back up onto the boat. Otherwise, he would have been a goner. So there was a divine hand in assuring that Joseph Smith's pilgrim ancestor was able to survive. So he was descended on both sides from Puritans who had come to Massachusetts to follow their religion and to seek religious freedom. So this is who the Smiths were. So they originally lived in New England, but they had emigrated up to Vermont, where Joseph was born. He was the third son. Ultimately, the Smiths had 9 children. So around 1812, when he was 6 or 7, there was this typhoid epidemic. His leg got infected. Dr. Nathan Smith, he came around and he said, look, I've got this procedure, and this may be able to save his leg. This surgery was very unprecedented. There was no anesthetic yet at this time. He was conscious. This is a picture of the surgical instruments. The surgery consisted of basically cutting open the leg, right, pulling out the infected parts of the bone. Lucy started to get hysterical, so they threw her out of the house. And you can imagine Joseph was he was screaming. As you see here, he says, I was forced from the room and detained till they finished the operation. So this was a major experience. So this surgery, it was ultimately successful. Remember, he's only 6 or 7, so he wasn't full grown. And so that leg never was quite the same length as the other leg. So he had this little limp for the rest of his life. So it took a long time to recuperate. So they were living in Vermont. Joseph Sr.'s older brother, Jesse, lived in Salem, Massachusetts, which was right by the sea, by Massachusetts Bay. And at the time, it was thought that sea air was good for healing. So he was sent off to his uncle Jesse to recuperate. So now his uncle Jesse was descended from Puritans. They were all very religious people. But Jesse, who was the eldest son in Joseph Sr.'s family, he was especially religious. We have a record of this. Later in life, he resigned from a congregation because they weren't Christian enough for him. And Jesse was the only member of the Smith family who never joined the church because he was
He was pretty stubborn from what I can
he,
remember reading in Lucy Mack Smith's account.
absolutely, that's right. So when Joseph was with him, I mean, he was laid up in bed. I mean, he was not going anywhere. So what do you do with a 7-year-old boy stuck in bed? I mean, remember, there's no video games, there's no TV, there's
Yeah.
no internet. So you give him books. And Jesse, being the kind of guy he was, would have given him religious literature. And Jonathan Neville has, in fact, doing this detective work of figuring out where the language of the Book of Mormon comes from, has actually found a set of books that were published by a minister in Salem and would have been around when Joseph was living there, which have a lot of phrases and language that appears in the Book of Mormon. So he believes like this is an example of the kind of stuff that Uncle Jesse would have given Joseph to read. So he was on crutches,
Do
you
we
know,
know how
even when
long he was in Salem?
about not quite a year, not quite a
That's a
year.
long time.
That is absolutely. And he was only 7 years old. So he only really knew his immediate family, you know, his older brothers and his sisters and his parents. And to be separated from them would have been very tough. So,
And I
but even
understand that they talk about pieces of bone that when they closed up the wound, they had to work their way out. They had to come out to the surface. Then they
that's
could be
right.
removed.
So Joseph says that there were probably about 13 or 14 pieces. So even while he's recuperating, even after his skin is healed and he's able to get around on crutches, they would still be these little, you know, pieces of bone that would then break through the skin, and you had to, you know, go pick them off, and
Right.
you had to clean it out. So the convalescence was very long. So that meant even after he went back and rejoined his family, he was of limited utility on doing farm work, which
Way
means,
limited, yeah.
yeah, way limited. In this picture, it shows Alvin carrying Joseph on his back with his crutches. Okay, so really the only thing he had to do was he may have helped Lucy a little bit in the kitchen, but mainly reading was the only thing he had time to do. So the family moved to a farm in Vermont. Joseph Sr.'s partner ripped him off and
Takes all the
absconded
money, yeah.
with the money. So they were really in a bad way. And so now lots of New Englanders had been emigrating to Western New York, and they were building the Erie Canal, which sort of opened up all of what is now called upstate New York. And this was going to open up new prospects. It was going to make it easy for a farmer to ship their grain to market because you could ship your stuff down the Erie Canal and then down the Hudson River to New York. And from there, you could go throughout the world. So Joseph Sr. left to go and find a place for them to settle. And then after he had kind of gotten a situation set up for themselves in Palmyra, you know, he wrote for the rest of the family to follow. And Joseph was still on crutches. And this picture, again, it looks like summertime, but this was actually in the winter that they were making this move. And so there was a incident that Lucy describes where they'd hired a man to help drive the wagon or drive a sleigh, actually. So there are 9 kids plus all their household possessions. So this was a major project to get this family moved to Palmyra. So Lucy, you know, she kind of went ahead with the younger kids. And then there was a man who was going to carry Joseph, who was still kind of lame in a sleigh, actually. But there were also a couple of pretty young girls who wanted to take the same trip. So after Lucy had left, he tossed Joseph out into the snow, literally. And so he could have the cute girls ride with him instead. And so it was only by the graces of some stranger who came by and found him that he was not left to just sitting in the snow with his bad leg bleeding. So there's some major events in Joseph's life that we could account for the Lord looking after them. So anyway, here's a little map that shows it was quite a distance they had to
Yeah.
travel. All right. So Joseph, he was He was literate. And there's a trope in the church, and it's been around for a long time, that Joseph was like just a stupid, ignorant boy. He didn't know nothing. He hadn't been to school. Part of it comes from Emma Smith's Last Testimony, the document
Right.
that was produced by her son Joseph Smith III. And one of the lines that she had in there was that he couldn't even write a well-worded letter when I first, knew him. So, which was the beginning of this. That was an early example of this trope. It's not like something we invented just in our times. Church members have been doing that for a long time, saying, "Oh, Joseph, he couldn't write, he couldn't read, he's
And
dumb, he's uneducated, and so
and
forth."
weren't they trying to do that? You guys talk about this in your book. It's sort of a way that the dumber he is, the more miraculous the Book of Mormon is.
Exactly. So it's a way of defending, trying to make the Book of Mormon look even better and more amazing. And so I'm not criticizing anybody for being tempted to take that tack, but the facts of the matter are historically that just doesn't hold up. And so the problem with advancing that idea is that it is easy for anti-Mormons to knock it down, because at the time that Joseph was translating the Book of Mormon, we have a letter that he wrote to Oliver.
In
And
1829, right?
that's right. And not only is it well worded and reasonably grammatical, spelling's a little dicey, but all spelling was dicey in those days. But it's coherent, it's well written, and even his penmanship is pretty good. It's easy to read. So the trouble with this is that it's easy to knock that down, because we have this letter, and we have another letter that he wrote not too much later, he himself. And again, it's a perfectly coherent letter, and his penmanship is even pretty decent. So this idea that Joseph was just this illiterate, dumb kid, it just doesn't hold up. And what we've done in our book is kind of flip the script, so to speak, because in his history, he says that when he was about 12 years old, he became even more concerned with religion. I'd been reading religious literature all along, but he really, really started to get into this. And of course, he lived in a very religious environment. So now here's some of the interesting stuff that we brought out in our book. Joseph lived in a society that was very literate. There were bookstores and newspapers, because these early Puritan Protestants believed that you had to know your Bible in order to be saved. Our early America was a very literate society.
Wasn't also the fact that you mentioned that Erie Canal being built, it sort
Right.
of makes that area a hub of activity, which would bring in merchants and booksellers and things that the rural part wouldn't necessarily have had as many books and things.
That's right. So for people who go to Palmyra today, if you go to the Grandin bookshop where the Book of Mormon was printed, it literally backs up onto the Erie Canal, which would make sense because then they could bring in paper and printing equipment and so forth. And of course, right across the street would have been some bookstores, one of them owned by a man named T.C. Strong. It was a society which was not the wild frontier. So, of course, you had newspapers. Newspapers were major factor in the early United States. Every little town had a newspaper because, again, no TV, no internet, no radio. So newspapers was how you found out what was going on. So Palmyra had a weekly newspaper called the Palmyra Register, and the Joseph Smith homestead is several miles down the road from the center of town. So Joseph Sr. would send Joseph Jr. That was one of his tasks. Once, he was off his crutches and he still maybe wasn't quite so strong that he could do heavy farm work, but he could walk into town and buy a copy of the Palmyra Register to bring home to his family, mainly his father. Jonathan discovered in the Palmyra Register an advertisement for this T.C. Strong bookstore, and it showed all the books that were on sale. And they were a pretty sophisticated collection of books. And being the nature of the times, these were very Christian Protestant people. There were a lot of religious books for sale. So a man who worked at the bookstore left an account many years later of his recollections of Joseph Smith, who of course had become the most famous resident of Palmyra. And he described how when Joseph would come in to get the newspaper once a week, he'd hang out at the bookstore. And he described Joseph as a meddling, inquisitive lounger. So you get this picture of Joseph. He walked into town, which was probably take about an hour. So you didn't like turn around and go right back, as long as you're going to make that trip. And you have this bookstore full of all these books. And so he had been reading since he had had his leg surgery. So he'd hang out at the bookstore enough to annoy the people who worked there. And my co-author, Jonathan Neville, has discovered a list of all the books they had on sale. He discovered that among the books listed was an 8-volume set by Jonathan Edwards. He was a preacher in New England. He became the most prominent preacher in America of his time. Now, he lived about 50 years before Joseph. Edwards died in 1758, but he was very, very prominent. He was very influential. And at the time of Joseph's life, they were in the middle of what was called the Second Great Awakening. It was a big amount of religious excitement throughout the United States. And it was the Second Great Awakening because there had been a First Great Awakening in America. And Jonathan Edwards was the preeminent preacher of the First Great Awakening. So everybody went back and started reading Jonathan Edwards again. But it's not just those books. His sermons were published in pamphlets. There were over 1 million pamphlets published of Jonathan Edwards sermons. And of course, all the ministers would quote Jonathan Edwards at length in their sermons because he was the prestige guy. Now, I bring this up because Jonathan Neville, my co-author, discovered a lot of Jonathan Edwards' language in the Book of Mormon, which nobody else had seen before. And so we went back for our book and said, well, okay, how would Joseph had come by this language? And Jonathan Neville discovered these 8 volumes of Edwards's works were available at the T.C. Strong bookstore.
Yeah. As well as these million pamphlets you talked about, right?
Plus 1 million pamphlets, and the preachers quoting Edwards in their sermons. So this was there was lots of ways that Joseph could have been exposed to Edwards's rhetoric that would then have flowed into Joseph's vocabulary.
I just want to emphasize that point for those who are listening, and that's phrases show up in the Book of Mormon that are not in the King James Bible.
That's right.
But they are in Jonathan Edwards' sermons.
That's right.
And the question becomes is how did Jonathan Edwards' phrasing get into the Book of Mormon? And again, Joseph Smith is reading these in the pamphlets, or if he's looking in the bookstore and hanging out and picking up some of these 8-volume sets and reading some of these through, right? He's going to have learned these phrases. He's going to have heard them.
So Joseph starts to become very interested in religion. And so he describes myself, I apply myself to them. So he's reading the Bible and his intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations. Now, the question is, okay, how did Joseph get an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations? So it had been assumed that Joseph maybe was going around talking to the ministers. But if you go back to the history, he actually only describes one incident where he actually has communications with a minister, and that doesn't turn out well. So it's not clear that he had a lot of direct conversation with Christian ministers. So if that wasn't the case, then how is it that he would have been acquainted with the different denominations? And so our argument is that he read these pamphlets, he read stuff in the bookstore. He'd go to the revivals. He wasn't the preacher's pet. He wasn't one of that, but he'd go to the revivals and he'd hear what they said. But he also had access to these pamphlets and the books. And of course, he read the Bible. So this is President Oaks. Being well read in the Bible, Joseph must have known of the book of Hebrews, reference to, and then he has a quote here from the book of Hebrews. But with this trope about Joseph being unlearned and not acquainted with the Bible and not educated.
Right.
But the point is that, in fact, Joseph was well acquainted with the Bible. And so President Oaks mentioned that in the General Conference.
So when Moroni appears to him and quotes all these Bible chapters, he can tell the difference. He's
That's
like,
right.
oh, it was slightly different from the way it is in our Bible, which tells you he was acquainted with it. He knew it. He knew Malachi and these Old Testament verses that a lot of times people don't read today. He knew
That's
about
right.
them.
That's right. Exactly. And so, but we have, if you don't want to believe Dallin Oaks, we have another anti-Mormon Palmyra resident named Pomeroy Tucker who knew Joseph. And he said that Joseph's attention turned to a spiritual and religious mind, and he frequently read the Bible, becoming quite familiar with portions thereof of both the New and the Old and the New Testaments. So this is from a hostile anti-Mormon who says, no, he knew his Bible. He read his Bible. So we have a Joseph here who is familiar with the Bible, is familiar with other Christian denominations. By the time he translates the Book of Mormon at the age of 22, he's been self-educating himself. Joseph was just 3 years older than Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln famously was all self-educated, primarily self-educated. And this was not unusual. Obviously, Abraham Lincoln's probably the most famous example, but this was not unusual for his time and place. A lot of prominent people may not have had time or the resources to go to school a lot, but they did read. So this was very much what Joseph Smith was. He was a person who read. So by the time he comes to translate the Book of Mormon, he's now in a position to imitate the King James style, which is what would have been expected. If Joseph Smith had just written a Book of Mormon in the plain language of his time, everybody would have just laughed. Nobody would have taken him seriously.
It wasn't a sacred text, right? A sacred book of scripture. They're expecting it to sound like scripture.
Exactly right. So this was very essential that he be acquainted with the Bible and with the theological language of his time. So this is why we have phrases from Jonathan Edwards that flow through into that. Natural man is an enemy to God is the phrase that we like to use as one example. Jonathan Edwards wrote a sermon called Man is God's Natural Enemy or something like that, which isn't really traceable to something in the Bible, but it would sound natural to the people in Joseph's time. And that's why the Book of Mormon reads like a 19th century work. So you have this situation where we believe that Joseph was getting a kind of formal literalistic translation from the Urim and Thummim, so he would understand what the Nephites really sounded like. But then he had to take this and turn it into contemporary language. And because he was reading religious literature for years and years by this point, because he was well acquainted with the King James Bible, he was in a position to do a translation of the Book of Mormon that would sound right, that would sound scriptural to his immediate audience. So we see this as a long process that prepared Joseph to produce the Book of Mormon that we have, which kind of got two layers. There's this layer of ancient language artifacts. Chiasmus is the most famous one, but there's lots and lots of other examples of Hebrew word structures and Hebraisms. So that would have come through the text that he got in the book of from the Urim and Thummim. But then there's this very 19th century sounding language, and that would have come from Joseph then restating the language in a language that would be familiar to and comfortable to his immediate target audience. So that's how we see Joseph, not just this blank slate, that dumb kid with no background, but rather very well prepared to do the translation of the Book of Mormon. And not only that, but prepared to lead and to teach and to become the first prophet of this dispensation. I just have to mention Terrell Givens did this short video where he was talking about a little project of his where he was trying to reproduce the library that Joseph Smith had in Nauvoo. Joseph was very much into education. So Joseph donated his book collection to the University of Nauvoo. And we have the list. We have that document. On the list are, there's another prominent preacher of Joseph's time named James Harvey. And Jonathan Neville also found a lot of James Harvey kind of rhetoric in the Book of Mormon. He was a Methodist minister, and there was a volume of James Harvey in Joseph's collection. So Terrell Givens was amazed at how broad and how extensive Joseph Smith's personal library was. And especially, he had a lot of books on religion. So he had James Harvey. He had a book of a handbook that was published for Catholics, according to Terrell. And he had lots of other literature from other religious denominations and studies of the Bible and guides to the Bible and so forth. He was just really, really quite amazed at the sophistication of this library that Joseph had pulled together that he donated. And that's taking into account the fact that most of Joseph's, when they fled Missouri, whatever books he had accumulated while they were living in Missouri, that was all lost. So he was starting over from scratch when they got to Nauvoo. So this is just a list of the books that he accumulated in the few years they were in Nauvoo, and has nothing, who knows what other books he had collected. So Joseph was a nerd. I mean, if I were to say to you, I'm going to describe to you a young boy who, because of some medical issues, started to read a lot when he's 7 or 8. He's into all kinds of different literature, and he's just an voracious reader. He collects books, he reads all kinds of books, and he's always thinking about religious issues and so forth. You'd say, wow, that kid sounds like a real little nerd, doesn't he?
Yeah.
That was Joseph Smith. So in other words, the first vision was not some unique, unusual, one-off experience. Joseph had been seeking for the truth for years before he had his first vision, and he continued to seek for the truth for the rest of his life. He was always trying to learn and expand his knowledge, and was seeking the truth. So you have, between critics of the church and defenders of the church, you have this odd trope where critics of the church say, oh no, there's all this proof that Joseph Smith was actually quite a bright guy. He did read a lot of stuff. He clearly was very familiar with the Bible. He was a real thinker. He was a religious genius. And the traditional defense is, oh no, he's just this dumb kid. He didn't have any education. The problem with that is that the critics are correct in that there's just so much evidence that Joseph was a curious guy. He was a well-read guy. He was a very intellectually engaged man. And that's what the historical record is. So let's forget this old-fashioned trope. The facts of the historical record are that he was a well-read, curious, intellectually active man. And we say that's great, because that's what prepared him to translate the Book of Mormon. And that's what prepared him to be the first prophet of this dispensation and do all the other things that he did to help found the church and start this dispensation.